My thief brother stole my grandma's jacket and gave it to his girlfriend, so I'm buying it back with his money. My brother Jake has been a thief since he was 13. Started with candy bars, escalated to electronics, even stole from our parents' wallets. He got caught repeatedly, but never learned. The one person he never stole from? His girlfriend Sophia. She thought he was perfect. Last month, our grandmother died of cancer. She left me her vintage green jacket with white floral designs, the one I used to model for her as a kid, drowning in fabric, making her laugh. It meant everything to me. Jake immediately asked to buy it for Sophia's anniversary gift. I said no, he begged, offered all his birthday money. Still no, he seemed to accept it. 4 weeks later, on their anniversary, Sophia posted a photo wearing a familiar sleeve. I checked my closet. The jacket was gone. Jake had stolen it. Instead of confronting him, I texted Sophia, told her the jacket was stolen from me, sent photos of me wearing it with Grandma as proof. Sophia was horrified, offered to return it immediately. I have a better idea, I told her. Let's make Jake pay for it. Literally. She agreed to help. We planned to meet tomorrow for the sale. Jake would unknowingly buy back the stolen jacket with his own birthday money from his wallet, but when I went to get his wallet from his room while he showered, I found something else. A shoebox under his bed, filled with items I didn't recognize. Jewelry, watches, wallets, dozens of them. Each with a label, dates, names, locations. Then I saw one that made my blood freeze. Grandma's house, March 15th. The date she died. Inside a small bag were her missing rings. The ones Mom couldn't find after the funeral. The ones we assumed the hospice workers had misplaced. Jake had robbed our dying grandmother. I took photos of everything, my hands shaking. But beneath the stolen items was something worse, a notebook. Operation Sophia was written on the cover. Inside were detailed plans, not romantic ones, criminal ones. Sophia's parents owned a jewelry store. Jake had mapped their security, noted camera blind spots, documented their routine. He'd been dating Sophia for access. The anniversary jacket? A test to see if she'd accept stolen goods without questions. The final entry, dated yesterday. Tomorrow. While Sophia's at lunch with Anna about the jacket, parents at supplier meeting 2 to 4 p.m. at back entrance. Safe combination Sophia mentioned. Her birthday backwards. He was planning to rob his girlfriend's family store. Tomorrow, during our meeting. I heard the shower turn off. Quickly photographed the last page and put everything back. Jake came out, towel around his waist, casual as ever. Hey sis, seen my wallet? Kitchen counter, I lied, having already taken the $300 inside. Cool. Sophia wants to go somewhere special tomorrow. Some lunch thing with your friend or something? My friend. He thought Sophia was meeting my friend, not me. She hadn't told him I was involved. That's nice, I managed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Should I call the police? Warn Sophia's parents? But I had no real proof he'd go through with it. Just plans. The next morning, Sophia texted, "Ready to meet?" Jake just left, seems excited about something. We met at a cafe downtown. I gave her the jacket, she gave me the $300, but I couldn't stay quiet. Sophia, I need to show you something. I showed her the photos, the stolen items, the notebook. Her face went white when she saw her parents' store layout. He's been using me? For a year. Every date, every moment, he was gathering information. She was crying now. The safe combination. I mentioned it once when I was drunk. Said it was silly they used my birthday backwards. We need to warn your parents. Sophia's phone rang. Her dad. Sophia? Where are you? Someone broke into the store. The safe? Everything's gone. Over $500,000 in jewelry. The cameras were spray painted, but the person knew exactly where they were. They knew the combination. Sophia, they knew everything. Sophia looked at me, devastated. Jake's not answering his phone. I checked Find My iPhone. Jake's phone was off, but his last location was Sophia's parents' store, 2 hours ago. But then Sophia's dad said something that made us both freeze. The police are here. They're saying whoever did this left something behind. A wallet, with ID. Sophia grabbed my hand. Whose ID? Someone named Anna Simon. My blood went cold. Anna Simon was me. That was my fake ID from college, the one I thought I'd lost months ago. Jake had planted my ID at the scene. My phone buzzed. Text from Jake. Nice try with Sophia and the jacket. But you should have minded your own business. Check the news tomorrow. Local woman arrested for jewelry store heist. Revenge is a bitch, sis. P.S. The police got an anonymous tip about your dorm room. Might want to check what's hidden in your closet. Love you. I ran to my car, Sophia following. We need to get to my place. Now. But as we pulled up to my apartment, police cars were already there, officers carrying evidence bags, my landlord pointing to my door. Through my window, I could see them in my room. One officer pulled something from my closet, a bag I'd never seen before. He held up jewelry to his partner. Even from here, I could see the store tags, Sophia's parents' store tags. Jake hadn't just robbed the store today. He'd been stealing from it for months, piece by piece, and hiding it all in my apartment. My phone buzzed again. Jake. But this time it was a photo. Him at an airport, boarding pass in hand, one-way ticket to Thailand. The caption, "By the time you read this, I'll be gone. But don't worry, I left you something special. Check your bank account." Oh, and Sophia? Your dad's Bitcoin wallet password was in your diary. Thanks for the 200K. Sophia gasped. My dad doesn't have Bitcoin. Then whose wallet? I opened my banking app. My savings account, the one I'd built for 5 years, was empty. But there was a new account in my name, one I'd never opened. Balance, $200,000 in Bitcoin, transferred from Sophia's dad's jewelry store. The police were walking toward my car now. Jake had framed me for everything. I stood on the sidewalk watching the officers move in and out of my building like ants carrying pieces of my life. Sophia gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin through my jacket. Her face was red and wet, mascara streaking down her cheeks in dark lines. The officer walking toward us had gray hair and tired eyes, the kind of face that had seen too many bad situations. He stopped in front of me and pulled out a badge. Detective Kavanaugh, it said. He asked if I was Anna Simon, and I nodded because my voice wouldn't work. He said I needed to come to the station for questioning, that they had some things to discuss about the jewelry store robbery. My hands started shaking so hard I had to shove them in my pockets. Sophia said she was coming with me, but the detective shook his head. He said it was better if I came alone, that Sophia could meet me there later. The ride to the station felt like it took hours, even though it was only 10 minutes. I sat in the back of the police car watching familiar streets pass by, thinking about how Jake had planned every single detail of this. At the station, they put me in a small room with a metal table and 2 chairs. The walls were gray, and there was a camera in the corner with a red light blinking. Detective Kavanaugh sat across from me and read me my rights. I heard the words, but they didn't make sense, like he was speaking another language. He opened a folder and spread photos across the table. My apartment, my closet. Jewelry scattered across my floor like someone had dumped out a treasure chest. He asked me to explain how all that merchandise from the store ended up in my home. I told him about Jake, about the shoebox under his bed, about the notebook with Operation Sophia written on the cover, about the store layout and the security notes and the safe combination, about finding Grandma's rings in a bag labeled with the date she died. I talked fast, the words tumbling over each other, trying to make him understand. He just sat there with his arms crossed, his face showing nothing. When I finished, he asked if I had proof of any of this. I showed him the photos on my phone, scrolling through pictures of Jake's collection and the notebook pages. He looked at them for a long time. Then he asked why I didn't call the police when I found all this evidence. I said I didn't think he would actually do it, that I thought maybe I could stop him. The detective leaned back in his chair and said that was convenient, that every guilty person has a story about someone else being responsible, that my ID was found at the scene, that stolen goods were hidden in my apartment, that a Bitcoin account in my name had $200,000 transferred from the jewelry store. He said it looked pretty clear what happened here. I tried to explain about the fake ID, about how I lost it months ago, about how Jake must have taken it. But even to my own ears, it sounded like excuses. The detective left the room and I sat there alone for what felt like forever. The camera kept blinking its red light at me. My phone buzzed with texts from Sophia, but I couldn't make my hands steady enough to read them. When Kavanaugh came back, he had another officer with him. They told me to stand up. They arrested me formally, reading charges I barely heard. Grand theft, burglary, money laundering. They put handcuffs on my wrists and walked me through the station. Other officers stared as we passed. They took my phone, my wallet, my keys. They took my fingerprints and my photo. Then they put me in a holding cell with concrete walls and a metal bench. The door clanged shut and the sound echoed in my chest. I sat on the bench and stared at the wall. Someone had scratched words into the concrete, but I couldn't focus enough to read them. My brother had done this. My own brother had stolen from our dying grandmother, robbed his girlfriend's family, and destroyed my entire life to cover his tracks. And he was on a plane to Thailand right now, probably drinking something with an umbrella in it, laughing about how perfectly his plan worked. I put my head in my hands and tried to breathe. The next morning, Sophia and her parents posted my bail. I walked out of the courthouse into bright sunlight that hurt my eyes after the fluorescent lights of the jail. Sophia hugged me in the hallway, her arms tight around my shoulders. She promised we would prove Jake did this, that we would make everyone see the truth. But I felt nothing. Just empty and numb, like someone had scooped out my insides. Her father stood a few feet away watching us. Thomas had kind eyes, but right now they looked uncertain, like he wasn't completely sure about helping me. I didn't blame him. If I were him, I wouldn't believe me either. Sophia walked me to her car and I got in the passenger seat. My hands were still shaking. I needed to call my parents, to tell them what happened, to ask for help. I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother's number. She answered on the second ring. Before I could say anything, she asked what I did to make Jake so angry. Not "Are you okay?" Not what happened. Just what did I do to deserve this? I tried to explain, but she cut me off. She said Jake was a good boy who made mistakes sometimes, that he wouldn't do something like this without a reason. She said I must have pushed him too far, must have done something to make him feel like he had no choice. The assumption that this was somehow my fault made my throat close up. That I was responsible for my brother framing me for felony theft. I hung up without saying goodbye. Sophia glanced over at me but didn't ask questions. She just drove. We ended up at her apartment because I couldn't go back to mine. The police still had it marked as a crime scene and I couldn't face seeing my violated space anyway. Sophia's place was small and neat, with plants on the windowsill and photos on the walls. We sat on her couch in silence. An hour passed, maybe more. Neither of us knew what to say. Finally, I started talking. I told Sophia everything I found in Jake's room. Not just Operation Sophia, but all the other stolen items. The watches and wallets with their careful labels. Grandma's rings in a bag marked with the date she died. The evidence of years and years of theft that no one ever stopped. Sophia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said something that made my stomach drop. Her parents had mentioned inventory problems going back 6 months. Small things missing from the store, amounts too tiny to worry about. They thought maybe they were making mistakes with the bookkeeping. But now she understood. Jake had been stealing from them for months, piece by piece, testing their security and building up his collection. All while dating their daughter and pretending to be the perfect boyfriend. Sophia pulled out her phone and called her parents. She didn't explain why, just asked them to come over. 20 minutes later, Thomas and Cecilia knocked on the door. I showed them the photos I took of Jake's notebook, the store layout with every camera marked, the security notes about blind spots and shift changes. The safe combination written in Sophia's handwriting from when she drunkenly mentioned it was her birthday backwards. Thomas took my phone and zoomed in on each image. His face went pale. He said the level of detail matched exactly what was stolen and how the thief got past their systems. Every camera that was spray painted. Every security measure that was bypassed. The safe that was opened without any signs of forced entry. It was all there in Jake's careful notes. Cecilia started crying. She grabbed my hands and apologized for suspecting I was involved. She said they didn't know, couldn't have known, that Jake was capable of something like this. We spent the next 2 hours going through every photo I took. Thomas had brought his inventory reports and he recognized several pieces of jewelry from Jake's collection. A diamond bracelet that went missing in March. A set of gold earrings from April. A sapphire ring from May. Jake had been stealing small amounts for months to avoid detection, building up to the big heist. Each theft was carefully planned and perfectly timed. Thomas looked at me with different eyes now. Not doubtful anymore, but angry. Angry at Jake for using his daughter. Angry at himself for not seeing it sooner. Angry that someone could be this calculated and cruel. Sophia pulled out her phone and called the detective's number from the card he'd given her at the station. I watched her explain who her father was and ask if he would meet with all of us. She listened for a minute, then nodded. The detective agreed to come to her parents' house tomorrow afternoon. Sophia thanked him and hung up. She looked at me and squeezed my hand. Her parents were already gathering their business records and inventory reports. They wanted everything organized before the meeting. I felt sick thinking about facing the detective again after he'd arrested me, but Sophia's parents had credibility I didn't have. Maybe he would actually listen this time. That night I stayed in Sophia's guest room because I couldn't go home. The apartment was still a crime scene, and the thought of being there made my skin crawl. I lay in the unfamiliar bed staring at the ceiling and replaying every interaction with Jake. How had I missed the signs that he was capable of something this calculated? I'd known he was a thief, but this was different. This was months of planning, manipulation, and betrayal. I kept seeing Grandma's rings in that labeled bag. March 15th, the day she died. Jake had stolen from her while she was dying in that house, while Mom and I were taking turns sitting with her, while she was too weak to even notice someone going through her jewelry box. The image wouldn't leave my mind. I finally fell asleep around 4 in the morning. The next day, Sophia's parents set up their dining room table like a war room. They had inventory reports spread out, photos of their store layout, and a timeline of the missing items. Sophia sat next to me and held my hand under the table. When Detective Kavanaugh arrived, he looked tired. He sat down across from us and pulled out a notebook. He started by saying he was here as a courtesy to the family, but he needed to be clear that I was still the primary suspect. My stomach dropped. Then he looked at the photos I'd taken of Jake's collection. His expression didn't change, but I saw his pen moving faster across the notebook. He asked why I had these photos, and I explained about finding the shoebox when I went to get Jake's wallet. He asked why I was getting Jake's wallet, and I had to explain about the jacket and our plan to make him buy it back. It sounded stupid out loud. The detective's skepticism was obvious in every question. Why didn't I call the police when I found stolen items? Why did I have photos ready that conveniently showed my brother was guilty? Why should he believe this wasn't just me trying to frame Jake after getting caught? I had no good answers. My voice kept shaking. Then Sophia's father slid the inventory reports across the table. He showed the detective dates when small items went missing from the store. A bracelet here, earrings there, a ring. Each theft was small enough that they'd assumed it was accounting errors. But now looking at the pattern, the dates matched when Jake had been at the store. The detective's pen stopped moving. He looked up at Sophia's father with different eyes. He asked to see the photos again. This time he zoomed in on the labels Jake had written. He compared them to the inventory reports. 3 items matched exactly. Same descriptions, same approximate dates. The detective leaned back in his chair. His whole attitude shifted from skeptical to interested. Detective Kavanaugh spent the next hour taking copies of everything. He photographed every page of the inventory reports. He copied all my photos of Jake's shoebox and notebook. He took down Sophia's statement about the safe combination and how she'd mentioned it to Jake. When he was done, he closed his notebook and looked at me. He said he would investigate, but I needed to understand that the evidence against me was still substantial. I couldn't leave town. I couldn't contact Jake in any way. If I tried to run or interfere with the investigation, he would arrest me again immediately. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading. Why didn't I report Jake's theft collection before the heist? I sat there with my mouth open. The detective waited. Finally, I said the only truth I had. He's my brother. I didn't know what he was planning, and I thought I could handle it myself. The detective wrote something down and stood up. He said he'd be in touch. After he left, I felt hollow. Sophia drove me to my apartment because the police had released the scene. We walked up the stairs together, and I unlocked the door with shaking hands. Inside, everything looked normal, but wrong. The closet where they'd found the planted jewelry was empty now. The police had taken it all as evidence. I walked through each room, touching things and trying to remember how they'd been before. Sophia followed me quietly. She didn't try to make me feel better with empty words. We started packing what I could salvage. Clothes that Jake might have touched made me want to throw up. I kept imagining him in here, planting evidence, going through my things, setting me up. He'd violated my space completely. Every drawer, every shelf, every corner felt contaminated by his betrayal. I was pulling clothes from my dresser when my hand hit something hard behind it. A phone. Small, cheap, the kind you buy with cash at gas stations. A burner phone. I held it up and Sophia's eyes went wide. This wasn't mine. Jake must have planted it as more evidence. Maybe he'd planned to have the police find it during their search, but they'd missed it. I called Detective Kavanaugh immediately. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold my own phone. I told him what I'd found, and he said he was coming right away. He arrived 20 minutes later and put on gloves before taking the burner phone. He turned it over in his hands and then looked at me. He said this actually helped my case. It was sloppy work that didn't match my known devices. If I was really running a sophisticated jewelry theft operation, I wouldn't leave a burner phone in such an obvious hiding spot. It looked like someone else had planted it and hadn't been as careful as they thought. 3 days passed before my parents finally called me back. I'd left them 6 messages explaining that Jake had framed me and fled to another country. My father's voice on the phone was cold. He said they'd help pay for a lawyer, but I needed to make things right with Jake. I stood there in Sophia's kitchen holding the phone and trying to process what he'd just said. Make things right with Jake? I told him Jake was in another country after framing me for $500,000 in theft. I told him about the planted evidence, the fake Bitcoin account, the ID at the crime scene. My father said I was being dramatic. He said Jake was my brother and family doesn't turn on family. I felt something break inside me. I told him Jake had stolen from Grandma while she was dying and he needed to choose whose side he was on. My father said I was the one making him choose and hung up. Sophia helped me find a criminal defense attorney the next day. Her name was Rosa Garcia, and she specialized in false accusation cases. We met in her office downtown. Rosa was in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. I told her everything from the beginning. The stolen jacket, finding Jake's collection, Operation Sophia, the heist, the frame-up. Rosa took notes and asked detailed questions about the timeline. When I finished, she sat back in her chair. She said I had a fighting chance. The photos I'd taken were good evidence. The inventory reports from Sophia's parents helped establish a pattern. The burner phone was sloppy enough to suggest planting. But she was honest. The planted evidence was sophisticated enough to be dangerous. My ID at the scene, the stolen jewelry in my apartment, the Bitcoin account in my name. A jury might believe I was guilty even with all the evidence pointing to Jake. Rosa said the first thing we needed was the digital forensics from the Bitcoin account and my laptop. She explained that Jake would have needed to access my devices to set up the fake account. There should be evidence of that if we looked carefully enough. Login attempts from unusual locations, changes to my computer's security settings, anything that showed someone else had been using my accounts. She filed requests with the police for all the digital evidence they'd collected. She also contacted a forensic accountant to analyze the Bitcoin transactions. The accountant would trace where the money actually came from and where it went. Rosa warned me this would take time. Weeks at minimum, maybe months. I needed to be patient and let the investigation work. I left her office feeling slightly less hopeless than when I'd arrived. A week after my arrest, Detective Kavanaugh called. I was at Sophia's apartment folding laundry when my phone rang. The detective said they'd confirmed Jake's phone was off during the time of the heist, but his last location ping was near Sophia's parents' store about 2 hours before the alarm went off. They were officially investigating him as a suspect alongside me. It wasn't much, but it felt like the first small victory. The detective said he couldn't share more details about the ongoing investigation, but he wanted me to know they were taking my evidence seriously. After I hung up, I sat on Sophia's couch and cried for the first time since the arrest. Sophia came and sat next to me without saying anything. She just held my hand while I sobbed. 3 days after Detective Kavanaugh called with the news about Jake being investigated, Sophia texted me that her parents wanted to talk. I met her at a coffee shop near campus, and she looked tired. She said the insurance company wasn't just going to pay out the claim without doing their own investigation. They hired a private investigator to look into everything. The investigator wanted to interview me, and Sophia said her parents insisted I bring my lawyer. I called Rosa immediately after leaving the coffee shop. She said this could help my case if the investigator found evidence supporting my story, but it could also hurt if they found anything that made me look guilty. She told me not to worry too much because insurance investigators were usually pretty thorough and objective. They wanted the truth, not just a convenient suspect. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at Rosa's office. When Tuesday came, I showed up 30 minutes early because I was too nervous to wait at home. Rosa met me in the lobby and we went over what to expect. She said to answer questions honestly, but keep responses focused and brief. The investigator arrived exactly on time, a woman in her 40s wearing a gray suit and carrying a leather briefcase. She introduced herself as Josephine Miller and shook both our hands firmly. We sat in Rosa's conference room and Josephine pulled out a tablet and recording device. She asked if I minded being recorded and I said no. She started with basic questions about how long I'd known Sophia, my relationship with Jake, whether I'd ever been to the jewelry store before the heist. I answered everything as clearly as I could, explaining Jake's history of theft and how I found his collection. Josephine took notes on her tablet while listening. She asked very specific questions about the notebook I found, wanting exact details about what was written and how the pages were organized. I pulled up the photos on my phone and showed her everything. She studied each image carefully, zooming in on different sections. Then she asked about my fake ID, when I got it, when I last saw it, whether Jake had access to my apartment. I explained that Jake visited sometimes and I never thought to lock up my personal documents around family. Josephine nodded but didn't show what she was thinking. The interview lasted almost 2 hours. Josephine asked about my finances, my school schedule, whether I had any history with law enforcement beyond the current charges. Rosa interjected a few times when questions got too invasive, but mostly she let me answer. Finally, Josephine closed her tablet and said she had enough for now. She might need to follow up later, depending on what else she found. As she packed her briefcase, she looked at me directly and said something that made my stomach flip. The Bitcoin account that was opened in my name required verification documents to set up. When her team examined the metadata on those documents, they found clear evidence of photo editing. Someone had taken my driver's license photo and digitally altered it to create the verification images. The editing was sophisticated but not perfect. The image files showed modification dates and software signatures that proved the documents were fake. This was the first real proof that someone else created the account pretending to be me. Rosa grabbed my hand under the table. Josephine said this didn't prove I was innocent of everything, but it strongly suggested someone had framed me for at least the Bitcoin part. She was including this in her report to the insurance company. After Josephine left, Rosa and I sat in the conference room for another 20 minutes. She said this was exactly the kind of evidence we needed. She was going to file a motion to have the charges dismissed based on this new information. The Photoshop documents proved someone had deliberately impersonated me to create the Bitcoin account. Combined with the other evidence about Jake, it created reasonable doubt about my involvement. Rosa warned me not to get too hopeful, though. The prosecutor might argue there was still enough evidence to proceed to trial. The motion might not succeed, but it was worth trying. She said she'd file it by the end of the week. I went home feeling slightly less terrified than usual, which was the best I could hope for these days. The motion hearing happened 2 weeks later. Rosa presented the evidence about the photoshopped documents and argued that the charges should be dismissed because I was clearly framed. The prosecutor argued back that the fake documents only proved someone else helped me, not that I was innocent. He said I could have worked with an accomplice who set up the Bitcoin account. He pointed to the stolen jewelry found in my apartment and my ID at the crime scene as evidence I was still involved. The judge listened to both sides and took a 15-minute recess to consider. When he came back, he said he was denying the motion to dismiss. He agreed the Photoshop documents created some doubt, but there was still enough evidence for the case to proceed to trial. However, he was willing to lower my bail restrictions. I could return to work as long as I stayed in the county and checked in with my probation officer weekly. Rosa squeezed my shoulder as we left the courtroom. She said it wasn't the outcome we wanted, but the reduced restrictions were something. I went back to my library job the next Monday. Walking through campus felt like everyone was staring at me, and they probably were. My arrest had made the local news because of the amount stolen and the dramatic circumstances. The student newspaper even ran a story about it. My supervisor met me in her office before my shift started. She said she believed I was innocent and the library supported me, but I was being put on probation until my case was resolved. One mistake, one complaint, one late arrival, and I'd be terminated. She said it wasn't personal, just policy when employees had pending criminal charges. I understood, but it made me feel sick, knowing my entire income depended on being perfect, while dealing with the stress of a potential felony conviction. I spent my shift shelving books and avoiding eye contact with other students. A few people whispered when I walked past. One girl asked if I was the one who robbed the jewelry store. I didn't answer, just kept working. Sophia and I started meeting twice a week at her apartment to go through everything we knew about Jake. We created a spreadsheet with every theft we could identify from his collection, listing dates, items, and any notes he'd made. We cross-referenced this with Sophia's calendar to see when Jake had visited the jewelry store or spent time with her parents. Patterns started emerging. Jake had stolen small pieces from the store inventory during at least 8 different visits over 6 months. Each time he'd volunteered to help Sophia's dad with something in the back room or offered to lock up at closing. Sophia felt sick seeing how calculated it all was. Every moment of their relationship had been part of his plan. We also documented every time Jake had access to my apartment, trying to figure out when he planted the evidence. There were at least a dozen occasions when he could have hidden jewelry in my closet without me noticing. We sent the spreadsheet to Rosa and Detective Kavanaugh. Rosa said it was good work and showed clear premeditation. Kavanaugh thanked us but didn't share what progress the police investigation was making. My mother called on a Thursday evening while I was eating dinner alone in my apartment. I almost didn't answer but finally picked up on the 6th ring. She was crying immediately, begging me to stop cooperating with the investigation into Jake. She said he was still her son no matter what he'd done, and I was tearing the family apart by trying to send him to prison. I told her Jake tore the family apart when he robbed our dying grandmother and framed his own sister for felony theft. She said I was being cruel and unforgiving. I asked if she remembered the rings Grandma wanted me to have, the ones Jake stole while she was unconscious from pain medication in her final days. My mother went quiet for a moment, then said Jake made mistakes, but he was still family. I said he stopped being my brother when he stole from Grandma's deathbed, and I wasn't going to protect him from consequences anymore. She started crying harder and hung up on me. I sat on my kitchen floor and cried too, not because I regretted what I said, but because my own mother chose to defend the son who destroyed my life over the daughter who did nothing wrong. 2 days later, Detective Kavanaugh called while I was at work. I stepped outside the library to take it. He said Thai authorities had located Jake in Bangkok. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. He was staying at a cheap hostel in the backpacker district under his real name, which was surprisingly stupid for someone who'd planned such an elaborate frame-up. Apparently, Jake was running low on money and tried to sell some jewelry to a pawn shop. The shop owner thought the pieces looked expensive and out of place for a broke American tourist, so he reported it to local police. Thai authorities checked the serial numbers against international stolen property databases and got a hit on Sophia's parents' inventory. They arrested Jake at the hostel and found more stolen jewelry in his backpack. Kavanaugh said the U.S. was starting extradition proceedings. Jake was being held in a Thai detention facility while the paperwork was processed. I asked how long that would take. Kavanaugh said it could be a few weeks or a few months depending on whether Jake fought it. Either way, he wasn't going anywhere. I met with Rosa the next morning to talk about what Jake's arrest meant for my case. She explained that extradition from Thailand was possible, but the process was complicated and slow. Jake could fight it if he hired a lawyer, which might delay things for months or even years. However, the evidence against him was strong enough that the U.S. government would pursue it aggressively. The stolen jewelry found in his possession in Bangkok matched items from the heist. Combined with everything else we'd gathered, the case against Jake was solid. Rosa said this should help my situation significantly. The prosecutor would have a hard time arguing I was the main culprit when the evidence clearly pointed to Jake. She was going to reach out to the prosecutor's office to discuss dropping the charges against me now that Jake was in custody. She warned me not to celebrate yet, though. Sometimes prosecutors refused to drop charges even when it was obvious they had the wrong person, especially if they'd already invested time and resources into the case. The following week, Rosa called with news that made me want to throw up. The prosecutor's office had offered me a plea deal. If I pled guilty to receiving stolen property, they'd recommend probation instead of prison time. I'd have a criminal record but wouldn't serve jail time. Rosa said she advised strongly against taking it. We had solid evidence of my innocence, and the deal was basically the prosecutor admitting they knew their case was weak but wanting a conviction anyway. But the fact that they were offering it at all terrified me. It meant they were still willing to take this to trial. It meant I might actually have to stand in front of a jury and convince them I didn't commit a crime I absolutely didn't commit. Rosa said plea deals were common and often used as pressure tactics. She believed we could win at trial if it came to that. The photoshopped documents, the cafe security footage, Jake's arrest in Thailand with stolen jewelry, all of it pointed to my innocence. But trials were unpredictable and juries sometimes made strange decisions. She said I told her I needed time to think. That night I barely slept, imagining worst-case scenarios where a jury convicted me anyway, and I spent years in prison for my brother's crimes. I told Rosa no on the plea deal. We scheduled a meeting at her office to go over our next steps, and she pulled out a thick folder of documents she'd been organizing. The timeline didn't work, she explained, spreading papers across her desk. The store alarm went off at 2:47 p.m., according to the police report. The cafe where Sophia and I met had security cameras, and Rosa had already requested the footage. She showed me stills from the video with timestamps. There I was at 2:43 p.m., sitting across from Sophia, the jacket folded on the table between us. Another frame at 2:51 p.m., both of us looking at my phone when Sophia's dad called about the break-in. Rosa filed motions challenging every piece of evidence against me, pointing out that I physically couldn't have been in two places at once. The prosecutor's office took 3 days to respond, and when they did, Rosa called me with an update that made my hands stop shaking for the first time in weeks. They were reviewing the cafe footage themselves now, and their response acknowledged the timeline created problems for their case. The security footage became the center of everything. Rosa brought me to meet with the prosecutor, a woman named Julie Anderson who looked tired and annoyed. She pulled up the cafe video on her laptop and we watched it together. The timestamp matched the store's alarm records exactly. Julie admitted, though she looked like the words hurt coming out, that this created reasonable doubt about my direct involvement in the heist. She still wasn't dropping the charges yet, but Rosa squeezed my hand under the table because we both knew this was progress. Josephine finished her investigation 2 weeks later and requested a meeting with Sophia's parents and their insurance company. Sophia invited me to come along since Josephine's findings would affect my case too. We sat in a conference room at the insurance company's office, and Josephine presented her report using a projector and slides like a business presentation. She'd tracked Jake's movements for months before the heist, documented every time he visited the jewelry store, mapped out how he'd gathered information from Sophia without her realizing. The photoshopped documents, the planted evidence, the Bitcoin account, all of it pointed to Jake acting alone. Josephine concluded that Jake had used Sophia for access to information, framed me to create a scapegoat while he fled, and executed the theft during a window when he knew Sophia and I would be together with proof of our location. The insurance company representatives took notes and asked questions, and by the end of the presentation, they indicated they would approve Sophia's parents' claim. Thomas caught me in the hallway after the meeting and pulled me aside. He said he never really believed I was involved, but the insurance investigation required them to consider all possibilities. His apology felt genuine, and I accepted it because I understood he'd been trying to protect his family and business. 2 months crawled by after that meeting. I kept working at the library, going to classes, meeting with Rosa every week to review our case preparation. Then on a Tuesday morning, Rosa called and told me to come to her office immediately. I drove there expecting more bad news, more delays, more waiting. Instead, Rosa met me at the door with tears in her eyes and told me the prosecutor had dropped all charges. Insufficient evidence combined with alternative suspect evidence made the case impossible to prosecute, according to the official statement. I sat down in Rosa's office chair because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore. She handed me tissues as I cried for 20 minutes straight, ugly crying that made my whole body shake. I'd been carrying the weight of potential prison time every single day since my arrest, and suddenly that weight was gone. Rosa let me cry without trying to make me stop, and when I finally caught my breath, she smiled and said this was why she became a defense attorney. Detective Kavanaugh asked to meet with me a few days after the charges dropped. Rosa came with me to the police station, though she said it was just a precaution since I wasn't under investigation anymore. Kavanaugh looked uncomfortable when we sat down in his office. He apologized for arresting me, explained that the evidence against me had been compelling enough that any officer would have acted the same way. Jake's frame-up was one of the most sophisticated he'd seen from someone without professional criminal training, he said. The planted ID, the hidden jewelry, the fake Bitcoin account, all of it had been calculated to make me look guilty. Kavanaugh told me he'd been a detective for 15 years, and he'd rarely seen someone go to such lengths to frame a family member. He shook my hand when we left and wished me luck, and I believed he meant it. News about Jake came through Rosa a month later. His extradition hearing in Thailand had happened without him fighting it, because he couldn't afford a lawyer, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The Thai authorities had caught him trying to sell more stolen jewelry, and between that and the U.S. charges, he'd given up on avoiding extradition. He would be returned to the U.S. within 6 weeks to face charges for the heist, fraud, filing false reports, and identity theft. Rosa warned me that I'd probably have to testify at his trial, and I told her I was ready. I wanted to look Jake in the eye and tell a jury exactly what he'd done. I started looking for a new apartment because I couldn't stay in the place Jake had violated. Sophia helped me search listings online, and we found a small one-bedroom across town that I could afford with my library job. Moving day was hard. Sophia came over with boxes and packing tape, and we went through my stuff together. Every photo of Jake went in the trash. Birthday cards he'd given me over the years, a mug he'd bought me for Christmas, a sweater he'd left at my place months ago, all of it went into garbage bags. Sophia found an old photo album with pictures from family vacations and flipped through it silently before adding it to the trash pile. We didn't talk much while we packed, just worked steadily through my belongings, removing every trace of my brother from my life. My parents called the day after I moved into the new apartment. My mother did most of the talking while my father breathed heavily on the line like he was too angry to speak. They were disappointed I hadn't tried harder to help Jake fight the charges, my mother said. He was still their son, still my brother, and family was supposed to stick together. I listened for a while before I interrupted her. I told them they could choose to support their criminal son or their innocent daughter, but they couldn't have both. My father finally spoke up then, his voice shaking, saying I was tearing the family apart. I told him Jake tore the family apart when he robbed our dying grandmother and framed me for felony theft. Then I hung up. Sophia was sitting on my new couch and heard the whole conversation. She didn't say anything, just moved over and made room for me to sit next to her. Sophia and I grew closer through the nightmare Jake had created. We met for coffee twice a week, went to movies on weekends, texted each other random things throughout the day. She wasn't my brother's girlfriend anymore, and I wasn't just his sister. We were genuine friends who'd survived something terrible together. One afternoon at a cafe, Sophia told me she'd started seeing a therapist to process the betrayal and manipulation. Talking to someone professional was helping her understand that Jake's actions weren't her fault, that she couldn't have known he was using her. I asked for her therapist's contact information and made my own appointment for the following week. We sat there drinking coffee and talking about therapy like it was normal, and I realized that maybe this was what healing looked like. Rosa's office had that lawyer smell, old paper and coffee that had been sitting too long. She spread the paperwork across her desk while I sat in the chair that squeaked every time I moved. The civil suit documents looked official and scary with all their legal words and numbered sections. Rosa explained each form, pointing at lines where I needed to sign, and I tried to focus, but my mind kept wandering to Jake sitting in some cell waiting for trial. She told me we were suing for legal fees, lost wages from the weeks I couldn't work, emotional distress, and the cost of moving to my new apartment. The total came to $85,000, which felt both huge and meaningless at the same time. Rosa leaned back in her chair and said collecting would be nearly impossible since Jake had no assets, no job, nothing to take. But she explained it would create a legal record of what he did to me, a permanent mark that said his actions had real costs. I signed each form, my handwriting shaky on some of the pages. Rosa filed everything electronically right there while I watched, clicking buttons and uploading documents. She printed me a copy for my records and put it in a folder with her business card stapled to the front. Walking out of her office, I felt like I'd done something small but important, like planting a flag on ground Jake thought he owned. The forensic report came back 3 days later in a thick envelope that Rosa forwarded to my new address. I opened it standing in my kitchen, pulling out pages of technical language and screenshots that made my stomach hurt. The analyst had found evidence that Jake accessed my laptop 3 separate times over 2 months using a keylogger he must have installed when he visited. The report showed exact dates and times, each one matching a weekend when Jake had come over to my old apartment. He'd watched me type my passwords, recorded my banking information, learned everything he needed to create that fake Bitcoin account. The screenshots showed file access logs, keystroke records, even the websites I visited during those sessions. One entry showed him accessing my laptop at 2 a.m. on a Saturday when I'd been asleep in the next room. He'd sat there in the dark, going through my files, setting up his frame. The analyst's conclusion stated clearly that the Bitcoin account creation required information only obtainable through the keylogger, which proved someone else had created it using my stolen data. I took photos of every page and sent them to Rosa, then to Detective Kavanaugh. Rosa called within an hour saying this was the concrete proof we needed that Jake had the means and opportunity to plant all the digital evidence. I put the report in a locked box under my bed because I couldn't stand looking at it anymore. The notification about Jake's return came through an automated system that sent a text to my phone. I was at the grocery store when it buzzed, standing in the cereal aisle holding a box of the kind Grandma used to buy. The message said Jake had landed at the airport in federal custody and was transported to county jail where he'd be held without bail due to being a flight risk. My hands went numb and I almost dropped the cereal box. Part of me wanted to go to his arraignment the next day, to sit in that courtroom and look him in the eye while they read the charges. I wanted to see his face when he realized I wasn't in jail, that his whole plan had fallen apart. But when I called Rosa from my car, she said going was a bad idea. She explained that seeing him might trigger emotions that would affect my own testimony later, and that I needed to stay focused on my role as a witness, not as his sister. I listened to her advice and didn't go, but I spent the whole next day checking my phone every 5 minutes for updates. Sophia texted me during the arraignment saying she'd gone with her parents, and that Jake had looked smaller somehow, deflated in his orange jumpsuit. She said he'd scanned the courtroom like he was looking for someone, maybe me, and seemed surprised when he didn't find me there. The arraignment details came through Rosa later that afternoon. Jake had pled not guilty to all charges despite the mountain of evidence stacked against him. His public defender, a tired-looking man named something I immediately forgot, had barely said anything beyond the standard motions. The judge set trial for 4 months away, which felt both too soon and impossibly far. Rosa explained I'd have to testify about finding Jake's theft collection, about the Operation Sophia notebook, about his history of stealing from our family. She warned me that his lawyer would try to discredit me, would suggest I was lying to cover my own involvement or seeking revenge for some imagined slight. We scheduled practice sessions for my testimony, mock cross-examinations where Rosa would play the hostile attorney. I left her office feeling sick because talking about Jake's crimes meant talking about Grandma's rings, about watching him steal from her while she died. 4 months felt like forever to carry that weight. My mother's letter arrived in a cream-colored envelope with her careful handwriting on the front. I recognized it immediately and almost threw it away without opening it. But I made myself sit down and read it, every word about prayer and reconciliation and forgiveness. She wrote about how families were supposed to stick together through hard times, how the letter never once acknowledged what Jake had done to me, never mentioned that he'd framed me for crimes that could have sent me to prison. It was all about forgiveness and moving forward and being the bigger person. I got out my own notebook and wrote a response by hand because some things needed that personal touch. I explained that forgiveness didn't mean letting someone escape consequences, that reconciliation required genuine remorse that Jake had never shown for anything in his entire life. I wrote about Grandma's rings, about my arrest, about the planted evidence and fake bank accounts. I told her that choosing to support Jake meant choosing to enable his behavior, and that I wouldn't be part of that cycle anymore. I mailed the letter that same day before I could second-guess myself, then blocked my parents' numbers because I needed space to heal without their guilt trips. Sophia called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was studying for midterms. She said she'd written a letter to Jake, an official breakup letter that his lawyer would deliver since she couldn't visit him. Her voice sounded steady, but I could hear the effort it took to stay calm. She told me the letter explained that their entire relationship had been a lie, that the person she'd loved never actually existed. Every date, every conversation, every moment of intimacy had been part of his plan to access her family's business. She'd thought she was building a future with someone who loved her, but really she'd been a mark, a target, a means to an end. Sophia said writing the letter had taken her 3 days because she kept breaking down and having to start over. She'd finally finished it the night before and given it to Jake's public defender that morning. The lawyer had promised to deliver it during their next meeting. Sophia asked if I thought she was doing the right thing, and I told her yes, that she deserved to close that chapter officially. She thanked me and said she was going to therapy twice a week now, working through the manipulation and betrayal. We stayed on the phone for another hour just talking about normal things, classes and weather, and a movie she wanted to see. The trauma therapist's office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown, a small room with plants and soft lighting that was supposed to feel calming. I'd found her through Sophia's recommendation, a woman who specialized in family betrayal cases. Her name was Dr. Sarah Anderson, and she had kind eyes that didn't look away when I talked about hard things. Our first session, I told her everything from the stolen jacket to the arrest to the evidence that cleared me. She listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes, nodding at certain points. When I finished, she said something that made me want to cry. She told me that Jake's actions weren't a reflection of my worth or judgment, that I hadn't failed to see warning signs or been stupid to trust my brother. She explained that family members could be the most skilled manipulators because they knew us intimately, knew exactly which buttons to push and which vulnerabilities to exploit. Over the next few weeks, we worked through my guilt about not reporting Jake's theft collection sooner, about the moments I'd covered for him when we were kids. Dr. Anderson helped me understand that children don't have the tools to stop adult patterns, that I'd been protecting myself the only way I knew how. She taught me techniques for managing the anger that would hit me at random times, usually when I was trying to sleep or focus on homework. 3 months after the charges were dropped, I woke up one morning and realized I'd slept through the entire night. No nightmares about police breaking down my door, no dreams where I was in a courtroom unable to speak. Just solid, peaceful sleep from midnight to 7. I texted Sophia immediately and she suggested we go out to celebrate, make it a whole thing. We met at a restaurant downtown, the kind with cloth napkins and a wine list. Sophia ordered champagne even though we were both underpinning because she said some moments required breaking small rules. We toasted to my first full week without nightmares, to healing, to surviving what Jake had tried to do to both of us. The restaurant was crowded and loud, people laughing at other tables, the sound of normal life happening around us. Sophia told me about her new responsibilities at her parents' store, how they were teaching her the business from the ground up. I told her about my forensic accounting applications, how Josephine had offered to mentor me. We ordered too much food and ate until we were stuffed, then walked around downtown looking in shop windows. It felt like a tiny piece of normalcy returning, like maybe we could build actual lives instead of just surviving. The trial started on a cold Monday morning in November. I wore the outfit Rosa had helped me pick out. Professional but not too formal, something that made me look credible and honest. The courthouse was bigger than I expected, all marble floors and high ceilings that made everyone's voices echo. Rosa met me outside the courtroom and went over everything one more time, reminding me to answer only what was asked and to pause before responding if I needed to think. Inside, the courtroom was half full with Sophia's family, some reporters and random people who apparently just liked watching trials. Jake sat at the defense table in a suit that looked borrowed, his hair cut short, his hands folded on the table. He didn't look at me when I walked in. The prosecutor called me to the stand after the opening statements, and I swore to tell the truth with my hand on a Bible. For 2 hours, I testified about Jake's theft history starting when he was 13, about finding the shoebox under his bed, about the Operation Sophia notebook with its detailed plans. I described photographing everything, the labels on the stolen items, Grandma's rings in their little bag. The prosecutor showed the jury copies of my photos and asked me to identify each one. Jake's public defender cross-examined me, suggesting I was lying to cover my own involvement in the heist. He asked why I hadn't reported the theft collection immediately, why I'd kept quiet about Jake's plans. Rosa had prepared me for these questions, and I answered calmly, explaining that I'd been in shock, that he was my brother, that I'd planned to go to the police the next day before everything exploded. The lawyer tried to rattle me, but I stayed steady, kept my voice even, made eye contact with the jury. When I finally stepped down, my legs were shaking, but I'd done it. Sophia testified the next day about how Jake had built their relationship over a year. She sat in the witness chair looking small but determined, her voice clear as she described their first meeting, the dates that always seemed to involve her parents' store, the casual questions about security and inventory. The prosecutor asked her about the safe combination, and she explained how she'd mentioned it once while drunk, thinking it was funny that her parents used her birthday backwards. She told the jury about finding out Jake had stolen the jacket from me, about seeing his notebook with her family's store layout mapped in detail. Sophia's testimony was calm and factual. No crying or dramatic moments, just straightforward answers about being used and manipulated. She explained how Jake had extracted information piece by piece, how he'd made her feel special and loved while gathering intelligence for his crime. I watched the jury while she spoke, and saw several of them looking at Jake with open disgust. One older woman in the front row kept shaking her head, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Jake stared at the table the whole time Sophia testified, never once looking up at her. When the prosecutor asked Sophia how she felt about the relationship now, she said it felt like mourning someone who never existed, like the whole thing had been a ghost she'd loved. The jury seemed to feel that, the weight of loving something that was never real. The prosecutor stood up for the next witness, and I watched Josephine Miller walk to the stand carrying a thick folder of documents. She looked calm and professional in her gray suit, nothing like the energetic investigator who'd explained digital forensics to me in her office months ago. The prosecutor asked her to state her credentials, and she listed off degrees and certifications that made the jury sit up straighter. Then came the forensic evidence about the Bitcoin account. Josephine explained how someone had created the account in my name using photoshopped verification documents. She showed the jury enlarged images of the driver's license Jake had submitted, pointing out the metadata that proved the image had been edited 3 days before the heist. The prosecutor asked if I could have created these documents myself, and Josephine said the editing software used wasn't on any of my devices, but was found on Jake's laptop seized in Thailand. She testified about the keylogger Jake had installed on my computer during his visits to my apartment, showing logs of every keystroke I'd made for 2 months. The jury could see exactly when Jake had accessed my banking passwords, my email, everything he needed to frame me. Jake's lawyer stood for cross-examination and asked if someone else could have used Jake's laptop to create these documents. Josephine smiled slightly and explained that the laptop's user history showed only one account. Jake's personal email was logged in. And the browser history included searches for how to Photoshop ID documents and Bitcoin account setup tutorial. The lawyer tried a few more questions, but each answer made things worse for Jake. The digital trail was complete and irrefutable. Every action traced back to my brother's devices and accounts. Detective Kavanaugh took the stand next, and I sat forward in my seat because I wanted to hear this part. The prosecutor asked him to describe locating Jake in Thailand, and the detective explained how Thai authorities had tracked him to a hostel in Bangkok after he tried selling jewelry to a pawn shop. The shop owner recognized some pieces from an international stolen goods database and called police. When they searched Jake's room, they found a duffel bag containing jewelry he hadn't sold yet, including 3 pieces that matched Sophia's parents' inventory records exactly. The detective showed photos of the items to the jury, each one tagged with evidence markers. He testified that Jake had been living cheaply, trying to stretch his money, apparently surprised that $200,000 didn't go as far as he'd expected when you're hiding from extradition. The prosecutor asked about Jake's behavior when arrested, and Detective Kavanaugh said Jake had immediately asked for a lawyer and refused to answer any questions. The jury looked engaged during this testimony, several of them taking notes, and I noticed a few glancing at Jake with obvious skepticism about his not guilty plea. His lawyer asked Detective Kavanaugh if there was any physical evidence linking Jake to the actual heist at the jewelry store, and the detective said the spray paint used on the cameras matched a can found in Jake's car trunk. The lawyer looked frustrated and sat down without further questions. The next morning, Jake's defense rested without calling him to testify, and I understood why when Rosa explained it to me during the lunch break. She said Jake's lawyer knew the prosecution would destroy him on cross-examination with questions about the notebook, the keylogger, the photoshopped documents. Better to stay silent than give the jury a chance to watch him lie under oath. The closing arguments happened that afternoon, and Rosa came to sit with me even though she wasn't involved in the criminal case. The prosecutor went first, walking the jury through the entire timeline of Jake's planning and execution. He showed them Operation Sophia again, the notebook that proved premeditation and sophistication. He explained how Jake had dated Sophia for a year just to gather information, how he'd stolen from his dying grandmother, how he'd framed his own sister to escape justice. The prosecutor's voice got quieter when he talked about me being arrested, spending a night in jail, facing years in prison for crimes I didn't commit. He said this wasn't just theft. It was a betrayal of every relationship Jake had ever claimed to value. Jake's lawyer stood for his closing and tried to suggest reasonable doubt, saying the prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and digital records that could potentially be manipulated. But his heart wasn't in it, and the jury could tell. He finished in less than 10 minutes. The jury got the case at 2 p.m, and I went to a coffee shop across from the courthouse with Sophia and Rosa. We didn't talk much, just sat there drinking coffee that got cold while we waited. My phone buzzed at 7:45 with a text from the victim advocate saying the jury had reached a verdict. We walked back to the courthouse and filed into the courtroom with everyone else. Jake was already at the defense table, his face blank and unreadable. The judge asked if the jury had reached a verdict, and the foreman stood up holding a piece of paper. Guilty on count 1, grand theft. Guilty on count 2, fraud. Guilty on count 3, filing false reports. Guilty on count 4, identity theft. The foreman kept reading, and Jake just sat there showing no emotion at all, not even a flicker in his eyes. I felt relief wash over me so strong it made my hands shake, but underneath that was sadness for the brother I thought I knew, the one who never actually existed. Sophia grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard. The judge thanked the jury and set sentencing for 2 weeks later, and then it was over. Jake's lawyer tried to get him released on bail pending sentencing, but the judge denied it because he was a flight risk who'd already fled to Thailand once. Officers led Jake out in handcuffs, and he didn't look at me or Sophia or our parents sitting in the back row. 2 weeks later, I was back in the same courtroom for sentencing, wearing the nicest clothes I owned because Rosa said it mattered. The judge asked if there were victim impact statements, and Sophia's father Thomas stood up first. He read from a paper in his hands, his voice steady as he described how the theft had nearly destroyed their family business. They'd lost not just money, but their sense of security, their trust in people, their daughter's innocence about the world. Cecilia went next and talked about the months of stress wondering if they'd have to close the store, the insurance battles, the fear that they'd somehow failed to protect their livelihood. Sophia didn't give a statement because she said she couldn't find words for what Jake had done to her. Then it was my turn. I walked to the front of the courtroom and read from the statement I'd written and rewritten a dozen times. I told the judge about being arrested, about the terror of facing prison for crimes I didn't commit, about losing 5 years of savings and nearly losing my entire future. I described finding out my brother had stolen from our dying grandmother, had used me as a pawn in his scheme, had destroyed my sense of safety in my own home. Jake looked at me once during my statement, just one brief glance, and his eyes were empty. No remorse, no recognition of what he'd done, just nothing. I finished reading and sat back down next to Rosa, my whole body shaking. The judge took off his glasses and looked directly at Jake before pronouncing sentence. He said this was one of the most calculated and callous crimes he'd seen in his career, that Jake had betrayed everyone who cared about him for personal gain. He said the sophistication of the planning and the complete lack of remorse left him no choice. 7 years in state prison with no eligibility for early parole. Jake's face didn't change at all when he heard the sentence. The judge added that Jake would also have to pay restitution to Sophia's parents and to me, though he acknowledged collection would be difficult. Officers led Jake away, and this time I watched him go, memorizing the moment because I needed to believe it was real. Outside the courthouse, my parents tried to intercept me on the steps. My mother reached for my arm, but I stepped back. She started talking about how Jake was still my brother, how I should visit him, how the sentence was too harsh for someone so young. My father stood behind her looking uncomfortable, but saying nothing to contradict her. They'd enabled Jake his entire life, making excuses, bailing him out, and now they wanted me to feel sorry for him facing consequences for nearly destroying my life. I looked at them both and felt nothing but exhaustion. I walked past them without saying a word to where Sophia was waiting by her car. Behind me, I heard my mother calling my name, but I didn't turn around. I was done trying to make them understand that loving someone doesn't mean accepting their crimes or pretending their victims don't matter. The civil suit judgment came through 3 weeks later. Rosa called to tell me the court had awarded me $85,000 in damages from Jake, covering my legal fees, lost wages, moving costs, and emotional distress. She warned me that collecting would be nearly impossible until Jake got out of prison and established income, which wouldn't happen for years. But having the legal recognition of what he did to me mattered more than the money. It was official court documentation that I was the victim, not the criminal. Rosa said she'd file the judgment as a lien, so if Jake ever did get money, I'd be first in line to collect. I thanked her for everything she'd done, and she said watching me stay strong through the whole nightmare had reminded her why she became a lawyer. Sophia called me a few days later with news about her parents' insurance settlement. The insurance company had recovered about 60% of their losses through the criminal restitution order, and Jake seized assets. Thomas told her they were using the money to rebuild and implement new security measures at the store. The best part was that they'd hired Sophia to help modernize their systems and train staff on security protocols. She sounded excited talking about it, like she'd found purpose in preventing what happened to her family from happening to others. She said working there felt different now, not like obligation, but like building something better from the wreckage. I was sitting in a coffee shop studying for finals when I realized what I wanted to do with my future. Watching Josephine work on my case had opened my eyes to forensic accounting, the way she'd traced digital footprints and uncovered the truth through financial records. I looked up graduate programs that night and found a top-rated forensic accounting program that focused on fraud investigation. The application deadline was in 2 weeks. I asked Josephine if she'd write me a recommendation letter, and she said yes immediately. Her letter talked about my analytical mind and attention to detail, how I'd helped organize evidence and spot patterns even while dealing with my own legal nightmare. She offered to mentor me through the program and said the field needed people who understood what it felt like to be on the receiving end of financial crimes. I submitted my application the day before the deadline. The acceptance letter arrived 6 months after Jake's sentencing. I opened it standing in my kitchen and had to read it 3 times before the words sank in. Full acceptance to the forensic accounting program with a partial scholarship covering tuition. Sophia screamed when I called her and insisted on throwing a celebration dinner that weekend. She invited Rosa and Josephine without asking, and when I walked into the restaurant and saw all 3 of them at the table, something shifted in my chest. These women had fought for me when my own family wouldn't. Rosa stood and hugged me first, congratulating me on earning what I deserved. Josephine handed me a small wrapped box containing a professional calculator with a note about needing good tools for the work ahead. Sophia had ordered my favorite dessert and made the waiter bring it out with a candle. Sitting there with them, laughing about Rosa's terrible jokes and Josephine's stories from other cases, I realized I'd built something real from the wreckage Jake left. A chosen family that showed up because they wanted to, not because they had to. My mother called 3 weeks later. Her voice sounded tired when she asked if I would visit Jake in prison with her. She said he was struggling with the adjustment and kept asking about me. I took a breath and told her gently but firmly that I needed to focus on my own healing and future. Maintaining contact with Jake would undermine all the progress I'd made in therapy. She started crying and said she understood but hoped I'd change my mind someday. I told her I loved her, but couldn't give her what she wanted. Not about this. The call ended quietly, and I sat staring at my phone for 20 minutes afterward. Part of me felt guilty for refusing her, but a bigger part felt relieved that I'd set the boundary cleanly. My father called 2 months later with reluctant permission to collect Grandma's rings from the evidence locker. The trial was over and the items were being released to family. I drove to the police station alone and signed the paperwork with shaking hands. The officer brought out a small sealed bag, and I carried it to my car before opening it. The rings sat in my palm, smaller than I remembered, the gold worn smooth from Grandma's years of wearing them. I started crying right there in the parking lot, but this time it was grief for her rather than rage at Jake. She'd loved both of us and never knew what he'd become. I slipped the rings onto my necklace chain and wore them home, the weight of them against my chest feeling like a promise to honor her memory better than Jake ever had. Sophia and I planned a weekend beach trip to mark 1 year since the heist and my arrest. We drove 3 hours to the coast and checked into a cheap motel with an ocean view. That first night, we sat on the sand watching the sunset and talked about how far we'd both come. She was thriving in her new role at her parents' store, implementing security systems and training staff on fraud prevention. She said working there felt different now, not like obligation, but like building something better from the wreckage. I told her about my classes and how forensic accounting was clicking in ways I hadn't expected. We stayed up late talking about our futures, making plans to visit each other during breaks, promising to stay close no matter where our careers took us. The next morning, we walked the beach collecting shells and didn't mention Jake once. The letter from Jake's prison arrived 4 months later. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won. I tore the envelope and pulled out 3 pages of cramped handwriting. It wasn't an apology. Instead, it was a rambling justification about how I'd forced his hand by not giving him the jacket, how Sophia had pushed him away by being too controlling, how the justice system was rigged against people like him. He wrote that if I'd just been reasonable about Grandma's jacket, none of this would have happened. He said he hoped I was happy now that I'd destroyed his life over a piece of clothing. The last line said he still loved me despite everything I'd done to him. I read it twice and realized he was completely incapable of accepting responsibility. In his mind, everyone else had wronged him, and he was the victim of circumstances beyond his control. I brought Jake's letter to therapy the following week. My therapist read it carefully and then looked at me with sad understanding. She said some people never develop genuine remorse or empathy, that their brains are wired to protect their self-image at all costs. We spent the session working on accepting that Jake would likely never give me the apology I deserved. She helped me understand that closure didn't require his participation, that I could find peace without his acknowledgement of what he'd done. We practiced letting go of the fantasy that he'd someday realize the truth and beg for forgiveness. By the end of the session, I felt lighter, like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't know I could set down. Rosa called on a Tuesday morning 6 months later with news that Jake's appeal had been denied and his conviction was final. She explained that this meant I could truly move forward without worrying about the case being reopened or relitigated. The legal system had spoken definitively, and Jake would serve his full sentence. I thanked her for everything she'd done, and she said watching me rebuild my life had reminded her why she became a lawyer in the first place. After we hung up, I sat at my desk feeling a weight lift that I didn't know I was still carrying. Some part of me had been braced for years, waiting for Jake to find a way to hurt me again. Now that door was finally closed. 2 years after everything started with the stolen jacket, I was finishing my master's degree and had a job offer with a firm that investigated financial fraud. Sophia was my best friend, calling me twice a week to share stories about work and her new relationship with someone who actually deserved her trust. Rosa and Josephine both attended my graduation, cheering loudly when I walked across the stage. My parents sent a card but didn't come, still unable to reconcile supporting me with what it meant about Jake. I'd learned that blood doesn't obligate loyalty to people who betray you, that family is something you can build from the people who show up when it matters. Standing there in my graduation gown with my chosen family around me, I realized I was genuinely happy with the life I'd built from the ruins Jake left behind. The rings hung around my neck, Grandma's legacy resting against my heart, and I knew she'd be proud of who I'd become. And that's the takeaway for this one. I love when small stories remind us how much we can still learn. If this one made you pause and think, that's all I could hope for.